Welcome to Human Monsters. Part 1. Early Life. These medieval crimes still resonate today as hideous, self-negating acts, as the strange gestures of a nobleman and hero transformed by his own ruinous desires into a wastrel and murderer. Jason DeBoer, from his essay entitled Blood Fuck God, The Prodigal Crimes of Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais was estimated to have been born in 1405. His place of birth was Champdos-sur-Loire, Anjou, France. His birth name was Gilles de Montmorency Laval. He was the eldest son of Marie de Créon and Guy de Laval-Rais. He was a descendant of a number of great feudal houses. Both sides of his family tree were rooted in aristocracy, replete with wealth, titles, and prestige. Gilles was born, rather fittingly, in a room called the Black Tower in Champs-Élysées Castle. Both his parents died early in his life. His maternal grandfather raised him and his brother René. Gilles, as a child, was noted for being above average in intelligence for his age. He was fluent in Latin, which was common among the highly bred and stationed in French society at the time. His appetite for freshly killed flesh was preceded in his childhood by a hunger for knowledge, and he read voraciously. He was said to possess angelic good looks. Typical of children who grew up as nobility, he was spoiled and entitled. There were no indicators of aberrant psychopathology, however. Indeed, H.G. Wells, who tried his own hand to figure out how Gilles de Rais could have become such a sadistic monster, feeding on the suffering of others, designated him unanalyzable. De Rais claimed in court that it was his family's tendency to accommodate his every whim during his childhood that likely gave rise to his feeling of entitlement. He certainly didn't face harsh discipline or rigid boundaries as a child. Still, other children growing up in nobility didn't emerge in adulthood with a drive to deliver such diabolical tortures on children. Though it didn't occur to anybody at the time, Gilles' aptitude for brute violence, with an absence of empathy and remorse, emerged during his years of combat, beginning as a 16-year-old soldier. There were no guns back then, but he was exhilarated by violent engagement and dispatched many opponents to the grave with his blade. 1427 to 1435. Gilles de Rais was a commander in the Royal Army. He distinguished himself when the 100 Years' War roared back to life. One of the highlights of his military career was the capture of the English Captain Blackburn at the battle for the Chateau de Leude. De Rais was married at this time, but speculation has it that when he found himself in witness-free spaces, he would explore homosexuality. Among his favorite books were the works of Suetonius, who wrote at length about the depravities of sexual excess in the Roman Empire. At his trial, Gilles said that these stories activated his fantasies and fascination with taboos. In 1429, his conventional, above-board relationship, his marriage to a woman named Catherine, yielded a daughter named Marie. Following Marie's birth, Gilles and Catherine were rarely seen together, and their sex life perished upon Marie's conception. Most of Gilles' sexual engagements at this point were with 10-year-old Etienne Corillot, a page, most commonly known by his nickname Poitou. Years later, Poitou insisted that Gilles assaulted him soon after he was hired and threatened to kill him with a dagger if he told anybody what was going on. He was only spared because of his physical beauty. Gilles de Rais's ego defied measurements of known proportion after his achievements on the battlefields and the decorations that were bestowed upon him by his nation's nobility. It was during that time when he began to live a life of self-indulgence and amorality. He considered himself to be among France's most valued citizens, and therefore immune to criticism and legal prosecution. He insisted that every whim be accommodated, no matter what the price or consequence. Vintage Gilles de Rais. Within that pathology, he was capable of just about anything. The date was September 1438. The location was La Roche-Bernard, France. Perron Lossart's son was only 10 years old, but with or without acting or speaking, he attracted attention. He was remembered as a beautiful child with expressive eyes. He was the kind of child who received more free candy than any other. Perron Lossart was his mother. She was on edge, and it had everything to do with her son. He wasn't in immediate danger. It was separation anxiety with which she was afflicted. The boy did not run away, nor was he abducted. What happened was that the Baron Gilles de Rais swept into town with his entourage, and when he saw the boy, he was instantly smitten. Were there sexual undertones to his feelings about the boy? Possibly, for he had never before made the boy's acquaintance and therefore knew nothing about his character and personality. The boy came from a working-class family, and though his mother despaired of the possibility of sending him off to take up Gilles de Rais's offer to raise him up in high society, bestowing upon him a top-notch education and aristocratic social status, it did occur to her that it was the greatest favor she could ever do for her child. It's an ancient narrative you might recognize in fiction. Pip in Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars, Charles Foster Kane in Citizen Kane. In real life, Michael Jackson. When a boy's childhood is sacrificed to ensure success in adulthood, the loss of what could and should have been is keenly felt, and there is often a feeling of having lived an incomplete life. Among the likelihood of losing her son forever, Perron also contemplated these outcomes. However, it is always incumbent upon a parent to consider the best possible options for their child. Gilles de Rais, a real baron, wanted to mentor the boy and take him into his care. Nothing could shatter the socioeconomic glass ceiling above the boy's head like this level of patronage. One of Rais's aides, a man named Poitou, real name Etienne Corillot, approached Perron about this deal and was eager to convey that it would be worth her while monetarily. To compensate for the loss of her son, he offered her £4 for the boy's services to de Rais as a page. 100 sous would be spent on a new dress for him. The boy would also resume his education at an institution cited as being among the nation's most prestigious. Perron knew there was nothing she could do that would benefit her son like what de Rais was proposing through Poitou. Hence, she agreed to the deal. The township in which she resided, La Roche-Bernard, did not offer the kind of environment where a boy like her son could thrive. Poitou assured her that the Baron would provide handsomely for the boy. It sounded legit. Gilles de Rais was the Marshal of France. He had been instrumental in bringing about a victory in the Battle of Orleans. A regal escort preceded his arrival wherever he went, and trumpeters announced his presence. Not a Miles Davis trumpet, but one of those really long trumpets. He was a figure of envy and awe. His party purchased a pony from the hotel owner for the boy to ride. Gilles de Rais and his traveling band, with the boy in tow, departed for the castle the following day. Perron chased after the band, having apparently had second thoughts. One of de Rais's servants restrained her. As far as they were concerned, a deal was a deal and she could not back out. De Rais used his servant as an intermediary, saying, "He is well chosen. He is as beautiful as an angel." Realizing what she was up against, Perron grew still and watched her son disappear along with the rest of Gilles de Rais's party. 2 years later, de Rais's servants passed through La Roche-Bernard, and they were accosted by Perron-Lassar. They were not accompanied by the boy. Perron demanded news about the boy's life and state of well-being. They were at a loss for a definitive answer, postulating that he was either in Tiffauges or Pouzolges. The truth was the boy was dead. He had been for some time. The concluding chapter of the boy's fate brought him to one of de Rais's castles. He was given a perfumed bath, dressed in higher quality clothes than his family had ever been able to make or afford. That same day he was fed a sumptuous feast, fit for royalty, and a gross of hippocras, which is a form of spiced wine. He was taken to a room upstairs, to which only Gilles de Rais and his inner circle could be admitted. It was in that room where he was informed that the day's pleasures would come to a shocking and violent end. The boy was quaking with fear. Gilles de Rais was flushed with sexual arousal. Seeing the boy's fear awoke the man's instincts for sadism. Poitou was usually involved in these sessions. As he told it, de Rais would begin by hanging the victim from a hook to prevent them from crying out. He would follow up by masturbating and ejaculating on the child's belly or thighs. He would then cut the bindings, bring the boy back down to the floor, and insist he was only playing. This proved to be a psychological cat-and-mouse trick, for the next step would be to murder the child, a task handled by de Rais himself or his cousin Gilles de Siey, or by Poitou or another one of his manservants, him being Henriet Grier. It was during this time, when de Rais's private body count escalated, that his personal fortunes suffered due to his own profligate spending. He financed imposing real estate projects. He facilitated and financed a lavish musical complete with over 600 costumes and an all-you-can-eat and drink deal for the audience. And we're not talking about popcorn, hot dogs, and nachos. Given that he was an aristocrat, only the finest feast would do. His family were so alarmed by his cavalier spending, they appealed to King Charles VII to intercede. He issued a royal edict that negated de Rais's freedom to sell property. More highly skilled at spending money than making it, Rais turned to alchemy. He figured that invoking demons would restore the money he'd lost. In 1439, he hired Italian Francois Prelati, who had once been a cleric. Prelati offered to summon a demon named Baron, who had the ability to produce gold, apparently out of thin air. There was a caveat. Baron would insist upon a sacrifice in exchange for his services. A human sacrifice. Prelati testified to a panel of judges that Rais offered him the hearts, eyes, and genitals of his small victims to satisfy the demon's demands. Naturally, the gold Gilles de Rais was expecting didn't appear. Despite his dabbling in alchemy and engaging in acts of rape, murder, and torture, de Rais touted himself as a devout Catholic. When he found himself at the point where there was nowhere else to go beyond the wall against which his back was plastered, he would cross himself or appeal to God directly. Like a shitty friend, he only turned to God when he stood to gain from the transaction. He always believed he would go to heaven, regardless of the atrocities he inflicted on others. This story gets worse, much, much worse. Gilles de Rais is believed to have raped, tortured, and murdered approximately 150 boys and girls. Other estimates had it that he left behind a mountain of corpses 800 high. You may ask, how could he have gotten away with such a thing? You have to consider his position in 15th century French society. He became Marshal of France at the age of 24. He owned large palatial estates. He was a decorated and esteemed military figure due to having been one of France's most involved generals during the 100 Years' War. With all that prestige, one may come to feel that they are entitled to whatever it is they want in this world, including the victimhood of innocent children. Sadly, some were so obsequious to him that they facilitated, managed, or turned a blind eye to the horrors he visited upon his young casualties. Whenever he craved another child, he would dispatch his aides to the smaller townships and villages to fetch a child to satisfy his appetite for fear and flesh. He preferred boys, but if they were unable to procure a boy, he would gladly settle for a girl. His servants said that once the child was brought to the castle, they suffered the same fate as Pervon's son, which always concluded with their untimely demise. Gilles de Rais committed murder impulsively, often killing servants if he was displeased with their efforts. As for the children, he disclosed during his trial what he did to them. He said, "I inflicted various types and manners of torment." Having finished with the torment phase, he would finish them off by strangling them, smashing their heads in with a blunt instrument, or hanging them from a hook in his bedroom. As he watched the twilight of their life fade in their eyes, he would, quote, commit the sodomitic vice on them. Indeed, he would continue sodomizing them after they perished, climaxing in necrophilic ecstasy, burning with desire as his victims' burgeoning rigor mortis matched the rigidity of de Rais's erection as a portrait of incongruity. If he found the child to be especially beautiful, he would decapitate them and retain their head as a morbid keepsake, though the macabre nature of the spectre was lost on him, or at least that's what you might surmise as he kissed the dead child's lips. He would retain the head until the sight and smell of death was more than any perfume bath could dispel, and he would dispose of his trophy. With that as a backdrop, it is fitting that his first child victim would meet their end at his hands during that time. It is believed that the first such victim was the 12-year-old son of Jean Joudon. This transpired in 1432, when de Rais's cousins Gilles de Sailly and Roger de Briqueville entreated a local furrier by the name of Guillaume Hillerier if they could employ the man's apprentice on a temporary basis for the purpose of running a message to the Rais castle in Machecoul. Hillerier obliged. This was a decision Hillerier would greatly regret sometime later, for the boy was not returned to his shop and was never seen again. Sometime later, Hillerier approached the nobleman to inquire about his apprentice's whereabouts. They were as mystified as he was. They suggested that perhaps the boy was abducted by common kidnappers and forced into servitude as a page boy. This was distressing news for the furrier, but he had no reason to doubt the men's sincerity and no means to determine where the boy could be located, living or dead. Kidnapping was a common and frequent problem in France during the Middle Ages. If former subway pitchman Jared Fogle had been alive back then, he just might have avoided being the recipient of his cellmate's footlong. Then again, it was also a time when a man could rape his way into marriage, with his battered and bruised bride at a loss for a means of escape. That happens in modern-day Pakistan, but fortunately the rest of the world has moved on. During the Middle Ages in France, landlords would kidnap children to populate their villages with workers and tenants. Finding the victims of France's most wanted was a rarity. A woman named Jeannot Roussin had a 9-year-old son who disappeared at that time. A possible witness to the abduction claimed to have seen Gilles de Sailly speaking to the boy on the street. It is most likely that if legal authorities approached Sailly about the boy's disappearance, he would have given them the same routine about child stealers. Jeanne Edelin was a widow who resided close to the de Rais castle at Machecoul. She reported that her 8-year-old son went missing. She described him as being, quote, a comely lad, white of skin and very capable. Without realizing it, she detailed Gilles de Rais's most idealistic manifestation of beauty embodied in a human being, like a cherub come to life. Like the other children who disappeared during that time, all efforts to track him down were for naught. While the search was on to find her son, 2 other local boys, Masserin and Alexander Justelier, also disappeared without a trace. After de Rais lost autonomy over his money and property, and black magic did not pivot his circumstances back to his days as a highly debauched youth, he lamented without end. Lament led to depression, and he was desperate for a pick-me-up. He sought this not in alcohol or whatever people in medieval France got high on. Raping, torturing, and killing children represented to him the right combination of actions that had the power to cure his spirits of melancholy. In August that year, the aunt of a young boy named Colin Avril was approached by one of Rais's recruiters to, quote, show him the house of the Archdeacon of Merles. In addition, the boy would be gifted with a loaf of bread. The boy's aunt must have been very poor, for she found this difficult to pass up. Still, she insisted on at least acting as a chaperone of sorts, as the boy accompanied the man. The next day the boy went to the Hotel de la Suze, where he was given some bread. Gilles de Rais and his posse were staying at the hotel. Naturally, Colin didn't realize as he ate the bread that he was about to end up on the menu. Colin's aunt never saw him again. During his trial, Henri Grier testified that the boy was brought to Gilles de Rais to the castle, where he sodomized him and followed up by killing and burning him. August 26th. Poitou approached Gilles de Rais with 15-year-old Bernard Le Camus. The boy was equal parts handsome and intelligent, a satisfactory find for de Rais. At his trial, Poitou testified that he bore witness while Gilles de Rais placed a dead child's hand and heart under a glass cover and concealed it with linen. He tucked it up his sleeve and took it to Prelati. The last vestiges of the boy's remains were buried adjacent to the castle. Upon the bi-weekly eve of Christmas, Jeanette Drouet, who lived with her husband and children in Saint-Léger, dispatched her two sons, aged 7 and 10, to request charity in the town of Machecoul. Years later, she testified that she, quote, had heard that Lord de Rais had then distributed there, and that, moreover, the men in that village willingly gave charity. There were many witnesses who claimed to have seen the boys in question in town that day, but nobody in town possessed knowledge of their whereabouts hence. Isabeau Hamelin sent two of her sons, ages 7 and 15, to Machecoul on Christmas Day to purchase bread. That was the last she ever saw of them. The next day, Prelati and the Marquis de Sèvres paid a visit to Isabeau's home. She recognized them as being part of Gilles de Rais's entourage. The men noticed her other son and her daughter in her house. They asked her if they accounted for all her children. Isabeau told them she had 2 more, but did not mention that they had disappeared. When the men departed, she heard one say to the other, 2 had come from that house. In 1440, according to Henri Grier, the Marquis de Sèvres, friend of Prelati, hired a teenage boy from the region of Dieppe to perform duties for Prelati as a page. After spending a 2-week period in Machecoul, the boy disappeared and was never seen again. Prelati's explanation was that the boy stole money from him in the form of 2 crowns and ran away to avoid the consequences. Henri later gave 2 versions of the boy's tragic and untimely demise. First, he claimed to have murdered the boy himself at Machecoul. In the second version, he denied having been present for the murder at all, saying he, quote, wasn't there, but Gilles abused him just like the others. It was in the same township, and at this time, that 2 more boys disappeared. One was the page of a nobleman named Dossi. The other was the nephew of a priest who dispatched him to learn to read and write. Eustache Blocher was employed as a domestic servant in the de Rais household. He said one morning when Easter was nigh, March 27th, he witnessed as Poitou entered the castle accompanied by a 16-year-old boy named Guillaume Le Barbier, who was a son of the village's pastry cook. The boy's charge would have been to toil as Jean Peltier's servant. Peltier was Catherine de Rais's tailor. During the Pentecost, March 27th to May 15th, 2 more boys left their homes and never returned. One was the 15-year-old son of a mason from Nantes. The other was the 10-year-old son of Thomas Essay and his wife. The couple were indigent and sent the boy to Moscow to appeal for charitable contributions. You didn't have to be Monsieur Colombo to discern that they almost always coincided with the appearance of Gilles de Rais' henchman, occasionally trumpeting de Rais himself. While on the run after committing heresy against the Catholic Church and violating local laws, Gilles de Rais went on the lam. While on the hunt for André Boucher, a choir boy who had been part of his entourage in 1434, he stumbled upon the 10-year-old son of a local man named Jean Laverie. According to Poitou, the boy was raped, murdered, and decapitated. The final insult came in the form of tossing his head into the latrines so that nobody would be able to smell the stench of the decomposing remains. August 15th, Gilles de Rais committed his last murder on this date. He persuaded the mother of a young boy to surrender him to his employ so that he could work as a page. He reinforced his credibility by giving the woman 20 sous for a doublet. Her son was murdered and incinerated. Part 3. Justice. Jean de Maustroi, the Bishop of Nantes, spearheaded a private investigation that unearthed evidence that Gilles de Rais was murdering children and invoking demons. Granted, this data was all based on gossip, but he considered it worth looking into. He obtained cooperation from Jean V, the Duke of Brittany, to move forward with a campaign to prosecute de Rais. When Gilles de Cellier and Roger de Brequeville realized the law was catching up with them, they fled from their then current abode. September 13th, Gilles de Rais was indicted by the Ecclesiastical Tribunal of Nantes. He was charged with sodomy, murdering children, invoking demons, heresy, and offending divine majesty. September 15th, Gilles de Rais was arrested. Prelati, Blanchet, Poitou, and Henriet were also taken into custody. September 19th, 1440, the trial of Gilles de Rais began. He was confident that he would be able to beat the heresy charges. For the time being, he was tried before the ecclesiastical court. September 28th, de Rais failed to appear, as if he hadn't already left everybody with a sour taste in their mouths. All the parents who lost children appeared to appeal for justice, but he showed them nothing but blatant disregard. Poitou and Henriet had been tortured into confessing. There would have been no point in them pleading ignorance. As previously noted, many of the parents recalled that the men led their children away into the abyss. Poitou detailed the routine as the child was brought to de Rais. Boys, and sometimes girls, would be lured to the castle on the pretense of something considerably more pleasant, only to behold Gilles de Rais' chamber of horrors after the sumptuous meal they were given. From there, they were hung from the ceiling by a rope or chain. Before they became unconscious, they would be taken down, stripped of their clothing, and raped. Once de Rais finished raping them, he or one of his lackeys would slit the child's throat or decapitate them, depending on his mood. Speaking of mood, sometimes rape, torture, and murder would not do for the Baron. On occasion, He would defile the child's corpse. Sometimes this included cutting open the stomach, masturbating, and ejaculating on their entrails. Following this, Henriet or Guerre would dismantle the child's body and burn it in Thérèse's fireplace. Poitou also recalled that when Thérèse's brother, René de la Suze, and his cousin paid a visit to Machecoul in 1437, Gilles de Siey and another of Thérèse's toadies removed over 40 children's skeletons from the castle. 2 were overlooked and left behind in the lower tower. October 8th, 1440. Gilles de Rais finally appeared in court again. He came across as unconcerned, though when he heard the complete list of charges being levied against him, he raged at the court, insisting he was innocent. Hearing he was accused of murdering 140 boys and girls must have left him a little rattled. He refused to take an oath, despite demands and the threat of excommunication. He called the judges simoniacs, or those who purchased ecclesiastical privileges. He also called them ribalds, i.e., people who are vulgar in speech and deportment. He felt they didn't deserve the right to pass judgment on him. To quote Thérèse, "I would much prefer to be hanged by a rope around my neck than respond to such ecclesiastics and judges." Thérèse eventually confessed to all the crimes except for the invocation of demons. He considered this to be something the church considered worse than murder. He was humbled by the unsympathetic reception he received by the judges and clerics, and literally begged on his knees for them to reconsider their decision to excommunicate him. His anguish came across as valid to the bishop, who reversed the initiative. As part of his confession, he stated that he began murdering children in 1432 or 1433. He confirmed most of the details provided in the testimonies of Poitou and Guerre. The court's record noted that he spoke, quote, "with great contrition of heart and great grief, according as it appeared at first sight, and with a great effusion of tears." Perhaps as a theatrical impresario and producer, he must have also picked up a few acting lessons from the cast. There must be some truth to this theory, for he appealed to the parents directly to forgive him, and apparently they were so moved by his show of contrition that they did exonerate him in their unofficial capacity to do so. Such was his charisma that he was able to elicit such feelings in people who had suffered such unfathomable heartache because of him. October 23rd. The ecclesiastic court found Gilles de Rais guilty of heresy. The secular court pronounced him guilty of kidnapping, torture, and raising armed forces without the Duke of Brittany's permission. He was officially designated an excommunicate, though the writ was rescinded after his show of contrition. On that same day, Poitou and Henriet were sentenced to death by hanging and burning. After all, enabling abuse is abuse. October 25th, Gilles de Rais was sentenced to hang and burn. He accepted his fate with grace, though he did request a favor. He wanted to die first, the reason being that he felt it was important to Poitou and Henriet that they live with the memory of de Rais's death. He didn't want them to think that he should get away with what he had done while they suffered. The court granted this request. They told him that his body would be buried beneath a church of his choosing. He was also permitted to make a full confession to a religious authority. October 26th. Gilles de Rais really had a way with people, for as the life was choked out of him, spectators wept and prayed for his soul. From medieval France to 20th century Scotland, we have another serial killer who targeted children. Robert Black was born April 21st, 1947, in Grangemouth, Stirlingshire, Scotland. He was born out of wedlock to Jesse Hunter Black. His father's identity was never disclosed to him. Jesse initially decided to place him up for adoption. He was not adopted, and she fled to Australia to escape the stigma of being an unwed mother. When Robert was 6 months old, he was placed with a middle-aged foster couple in Kinlochleven by the name of Jack and Margaret Tulip. He went by their surname until years later when he learned about his birth mother's identity. As a child, Robert demonstrated antisocial tendencies. He was short-tempered and aggressive, and his reputation as such did not win him many friends. He would fly into senseless tantrums and vandalize school property. He was singled out for bullying by his peers. Reinforcing the pecking order, he started to pick on younger children. Margaret was a stickler for hygiene, but she could not convince young Robert of its importance, and Robert came to be known as Smelly Bobby Tulip by his classmates. One day, Robert and a girl his age compared genitalia. The experience made a profound impact on him. He believed he should have been born a girl. This led to a fascination with genitalia of both sexes and of other bodily orifices. From the age of 8 onwards, he would insert objects into his anus. This would continue into adulthood. Neighbors recalled seeing Robert with bruises on his limbs and face, with the implication being that he was being abused by his foster parents. Robert was asked about this years later and said he could not remember how he acquired the bruises, but surmised that childhood fights must have been the origin point. Despite this, he did recall being verbally and physically abused by his foster parents because he was a chronic bedwetter. By the time 1958 rolled around, both the Tulips had died and Robert was placed with another family in Kinlochleven. It was about that time when he committed his first sexual assault. He dragged a young girl into a public washroom and molested her. His foster mother was aware of this incident and reported it to the police, whereupon she refused to keep him in her home. For his teen years, Robert was placed in a home where he cohabited with other young people of both sexes on the outer rim of Falkirk. He frequently exposed himself to girls. One incident had him forcibly removing the panties from a girl. As a consequence, he was sent to Red House Care Home, which was a reform school of sorts for wayward boys. He was filed as boy number 28. Robert was sexually abused by a male staff member for 3 years, which usually took the form of forcing him to perform fellatio. He also studied at Musselburgh, where he involved himself in football and swimming. His classmates remember him as being socially withdrawn and having few friends. 1963. Robert was discharged from Red House. With the help of social services, He moved to a boys' home in Greenock. He got a job as a butcher's delivery boy. He would later boast that he fondled 30 to 40 girls while making deliveries, if, when he arrived at the house, he discovered the victim was alone. None of those incidents were ever brought to the attention of the police. One summer night that year, Robert approached a 7-year-old girl in a park. She was playing by herself. He lured her to a deserted air raid shelter by telling her he had a litter of kittens to show her. Once they were out of sight of witnesses, he grabbed her by the throat and squeezed until she passed out. He masturbated and ejaculated on her body. The next day, Robert was placed under arrest and charged with lewd and libidinous behavior. A psychiatrist evaluated Robert and the event itself and decided it was an isolated incident, and therefore Robert was not in need of treatment. He was admonished for the crime. Robert moved to Grangemouth. He lived with an elderly couple. He worked for a builder's supply company. He began dating a young woman he met at the local youth club. She is his only known girlfriend, according to the official record. They dated for a few months. Robert has said he asked her to marry him. She brought the relationship to an abrupt halt, which devastated Robert. Ultimately, she found his sexual demands difficult to accept. 1966. Robert's landlords discovered he molested their 9-year-old granddaughter whenever she visited them. They evicted him, but did not notify the police of the offense. They felt that involving their granddaughter in the investigation would only exacerbate her trauma. Robert lost his job at this time. He moved back to Kinlochleven. There, he rented a room from a married couple who had a 6-year-old daughter. Less than a year later, his landlords informed police that Robert Black molested their daughter several times. He pled guilty to 3 counts of indecent assault against a child and was sentenced to serve a year at Polmont Borstal in Brightons, an institution that specialized in rehabilitating young offenders. Black has refused to discuss his year spent at Polmont Borstal. Speculation has it that he may have been abused during his time there. September 1969. Robert Black moved to London. There he held several jobs, one of which was as a lifeguard at a public pool. He was fired for molesting a little girl there. The management did not report the offense to the police. Through a man he met at King's Cross Bookshop, he began to collect child pornography. Initially, the material was published in magazines and single photographs, but eventually he came into possession of motion pictures depicting the graphic and violent sexual abuse of children. Black was an amateur photographer, and he took photos clandestinely of girls aged 8 through 12. This was done most frequently at public pools. He stored these images with his child pornography collection, which was kept in locked suitcases. Robert Black rented an attic for his living space. The couple who rented it to him suspected him of being fond of pornography, but were not aware that it involved images of children. He lived at that home until he was arrested. Black bought a Fiat van and embarked on a career as a professional driver. He delivered posters of pop stars and billboard displays. He drove long hauls, which put him at an advantage since his married colleagues preferred regionals. This position enabled him to acquire a thorough knowledge of Britain's roadways, including areas where one could dispose of a body without witnesses and discovery. He also developed a repertoire of disguises and other alterations to his appearance, such as growing and shaving off beards and wearing several pairs of non-prescription glasses. He installed opaque black curtains in his van. August 12, 1981. 9-year-old Jennifer Carty was last seen by her mother at 1:40 p.m. when she departed for a friend's house on her bicycle in Ballinderry County, Antrim. She never turned up at her destination because she was kidnapped, raped, and murdered by Robert Black. Hours later, her bicycle was found. It was covered with natural detritus like branches and leaves. The bicycle's stand was down, implying that she had stopped the bicycle to stop to talk to someone. 200 volunteers embarked on a search for the girl, but she could not be found. 6 days later, Jennifer's body was found by 2 anglers in a reservoir near a lay-by in Hillsborough, which was located 16 miles from her home. The coroner found signs of sexual assault on her body and underpants. The cause of death was determined to be drowning, which was partially accomplished by ligature strangulation. July 30th, 1982. 11-year-old Susan Claire Maxwell lived in Cornhill-on-Tweed. She was kidnapped while walking home from playing tennis in Coldstream. She was last seen alive at 4:30 p.m. while crossing the bridge over the River Tweed. Theoretically, she was abducted by Black minutes later. The next day, a full-scale search for Susan was carried out. 300 police officers were assigned to the case, and search dogs were employed to sniff her out. None of these efforts yielded the intended result. August 12th, a delivery driver found Susan's remains, which were buried under leaves and branches in a copse. She was fully clothed except for her shoes and panties. Due to the advanced stages of decomposition, the exact date of death could not be ascertained. She had been bound and gagged with sticking plaster. Her panties were folded and placed beneath her head. This was an implication that she had been raped. July 8th, 1983. 5-year-old Caroline Hogue disappeared while playing outside her home on beach land in Portobello, a suburb of Edinburgh. When she still hadn't returned at 7:30 p.m., her family took to the streets to find her. A boy reported seeing her on a promenade nearby. The police were contacted shortly thereafter. The search for Caroline Hogue was the largest such operation in Scottish history at the time. Witnesses recalled seeing a man they described as, quote, furtive, a poorly groomed, balding man who wore horn-rimmed glasses. They recalled him watching Caroline like a hawk and then following her to a playground nearby. A 14-year-old girl recalls seeing the man and Caroline sitting on a bench. Whatever the man said to Caroline, she said in response, "Yes, please." They embarked on a trek to a fairground. He paid 15 pence for her to ride on a carousel. He watched her the entire time. A witness said that as the man drew Caroline away from the fairground at 7:30 p.m., she looked afraid. He abducted Caroline and kept her in his van for the next 24 hours as he went about his delivery route. July 18th. Caroline Hoag's remains were discovered in a ditch near the M1 motorway in Twycross. She was stark naked. Her body had decomposed for so long the cause of death could not be determined. Her body was infested by insects to the degree that it was estimated that she was killed around July 12th. The lack of clothing was the only indicator of sexual assault. In March, a dramatization of the abduction was aired on national television. Caroline's father said, "You think it could never happen to you, but it has proven time and time again that it can. And it could again if this man isn't caught in the near future." Detectives surmised that Caroline Hoag and Susan Maxwell were murdered by the same person. They also figured out that the perpetrator was a delivery driver, since the girls' corpses had been dumped along routes frequented by long-haul truck drivers. March 26, 1986, 7:50 p.m. 10-year-old Sarah Jane Harper disappeared from Morley, a suburb of Leeds, after leaving her home to buy a loaf of bread at a corner store. The clerk confirmed seeing the girl at the shop at that time. They also remembered seeing a balding man enter the store within moments of Sarah's purchase and leaving almost immediately after her departure. Sarah was last seen alive by two girls as she walked into an alley toward her home. By 8:30 p.m., Sarah still had not returned home. Her mother Jackie and younger sister Claire took to the streets to find Sarah. They couldn't find her, so they reported her disappearance to the police. 100 officers were assigned to the investigation. 200 locals volunteered to search, and police divers conducted an underwater search. At a press conference, Jackie made a direct appeal to the perpetrator, saying, "I just want her back, even if she's dead. If someone would just pick up the phone and tell us where the body is." April 19th. A man found Sarah's partially nude remains. She had been gagged and bound. She was floating in the River Trent. The official cause of death was drowning. Signs of blunt force trauma were found on her face, forehead, head, and neck. Due to this, speculation has it that she was unconscious when she was thrown into the river. She was also the victim of a sexual assault so brutal she suffered perimortem internal injuries, which the coroner described as, quote, "simply terrible." Investigators initially doubted that the murder of Sarah Harper could be linked to those of Caroline Hoag and Susan Maxwell. Police consulted lists of convicted sex offenders, but surprisingly, Robert Black was not on the list, despite having been convicted of a sexual assault on a child. April 23rd, 1988. 15-year-old Tessa Thornhill, after separating from her boyfriend on the way home, was a victim of an attempted abduction by Robert Black. She was 4 foot 11 inches tall, which may have given Black the impression that she was much younger. Black asked her if she could fix engines. She said she could not and began to walk faster. He got out and placed one arm over her mouth and the other around her stomach and tried to drag her into his van. As he pulled her in, she fought back, punching and kicking him. She took the tack of squeezing his testicles with full force, which caused him to loosen his grip. She took this opportunity to bite into his right arm. Black shouted, "Oh, you bitch!" Tessa shouted for her mother as she tried to escape from the van. Tessa's deus ex machina came in the form of her boyfriend, who ordered Black to let her go. Black ran into the van and drove off. Tessa reported the incident to her parents, who informed the police. Tessa and her boyfriend were both questioned. July 14th, 1990. A Good Samaritan witnessed as Black abducted a 6-year-old girl. He got part of the van's license plate number and reported the incident to the girl's parents, who called the police. The man who witnessed the abduction was directly involved in identifying him while in the company of the police, who had dispatched 6 cars. Adding further gravitas to the situation, one of the officers was the father of the girl. Once the van was pulled over and Robert Black was placed under arrest, the officer got into the van. He noticed movement inside a sleeping bag. He untied the drawstring and found his daughter inside. Her wrists had been bound behind her back. Her legs were tied together. Her mouth was gagged with sticking plaster, and a hood had been tied over her head. A doctor determined after an examination that she had been digitally penetrated. On the way to the police station, Black said to one of the officers, "It was a rush of blood to the head. I have always liked little girls since I was a lad. I tied her up because I wanted to keep her until I had dropped a parcel off. I was going to let her go." He was charged with abduction and remanded in jail. A search of his van yielded ropes, sticking plaster, and hoods, a Polaroid camera, numerous articles of girls' clothing, a mattress, and sexual aids. In his home was found his large trove of child pornography, children's clothing, and a semen-stained newspaper article about the attempted abduction of Tessa Thornhill. August 10th, 1990. Robert Black was tried for abduction and rape. He was sentenced to life in prison. He announced his intention to appeal, but did not follow through. April 13th, 1994. Robert Black appeared in court once again. He faced charges of kidnap, murder, attempted kidnap, and preventing the lawful burial of a body. He pleaded not guilty. Evidence and witness testimony did not bode well for Black's possibility of ever being released from prison in his lifetime. May 19th. Robert Black was found guilty of 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of preventing the lawful burial of a body, and, in relation to Teresa Thornhill, 1 count of attempted abduction. He received a life sentence for each charge, with eligibility for parole only after serving 35 years. The sentences were to be served concurrently. The judge described Black as the perpetrator of offenses which, quote, are unlikely ever to be forgotten and which represent a man at his most vile. Black is said to have appeared unmoved throughout the trial. Black was taken to Wakefield Prison, where he began his sentence. Hector Clark, who was one of the detectives working on the cases of the missing girls, was quoted as saying at a press conference, "The tragedy is These three beautiful children who should never have died. Black is the most evil of characters, and I hope there is not now or ever another one like him. Black is a man of the most evil kind. December 15th, 2009. Robert Black was summoned to court to face charges for the 1981 murder of Jennifer Carty. He was formally charged on September 22nd, 2011. He pleaded not guilty. Evidence proving he had been in the area at the time of the abduction, like gas station receipts, was introduced into court, among many other things. He received another life sentence. He refused to cooperate with investigators and never admitted to the crimes. As Ray Wire, a pioneer in the field of treating sex offenders, put it, he's the sort of person for whom it's all about power and control. Having information about what he's done gives him power. He has no desire to ease his conscience, and he's not going to give up the one thing that gives him power over the pain that his victims' families are suffering. Robert Black was suspected of abducting, raping, and killing 14 other girls in locations as far afield as the Netherlands and France, though authorities could not gather enough evidence of his guilt. January 12, 2016. Robert Black died of a heart attack. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.